close your eyes and let your breath slow. Imagine a world without alarms, without blinking numbers, without the relentless ticking of hands on a dial. A world before seconds were sliced into slivers, before the sun's rising had a timestamp and its setting marked a deadline. In this world, time does not chase anyone. It drifts, like wind through tall grass, like water trickling through stone. They lived and moved in harmony with rhythms older than civilization. The way birds called differently in the morning than at dusk. To them, time was something you felt, not something you owned. It was sensed in the warmth of the light, the length of a shadow, the scent of the air before night fell. Time was presence, not pressure. It is the world of our ancestors, where time was not trapped in metal gears or glowing screens, but whispered by firelight, sung by birds, painted across the sky. To them, the sun was a deity, and the passage of its shadow across temple walls was divine choreography. Common people, farmers especially, relied on the sun's position to determine when to water crops, when to harvest, and when to rest. In those wide-open deserts, the angle of a shadow could mean the difference between life and death. A day too early or too late could ruin a harvest. The sun was not just a celestial body. It was a calendar, a clock, and a companion. Their sundials were not simply instruments of timekeeping. They were sacred bridges between earth and sky. This is where our story begins. Nomadic tribes, living under skies too bright for shadows at midday, learned instead to read the sand. In the morning, the ground was cool, soft underfoot. By midday, it was blistering, unforgiving. The sky, vast, patient, eternal, was their night clock. Long before Galileo ever lifted a telescope, people noticed how the stars moved. Certain constellations rose in winter, others in summer. The stars told stories and also signaled the turning of the year. For a shepherd guarding a flock under the stars, the position of Orion might say it's midnight. The rising of Sirius might tell an Egyptian priest that the Nile's flood is near. To look at the sky was to look at a clock that never stopped turning. The change in temperature, texture, and even the smell of the sand gave them a sense of the day's arc. Fishing tribes knew that tides followed the moon. Farmers watched its light to guide planting and harvest. In many early societies, the moon was so reliable that it became the basis for calendars. Months marked by moons, lives lived by its phases. A life where no one said, "I'm running out of time," but rather, "I'm moving with it." Because, in its way of keeping time, there is something we've lost. A softness, a patience, a trust in the turning of the world. Where people didn't measure time in minutes lost, but in moments felt. A culture where a child learns to tell time not by glancing at a screen. The fire flickers, casting long shadows on the earth. The woman tucks her children in and steps outside once more. She looks up, watches a familiar constellation rise in the east. No numbers, no ticking, but she knows it is time for rest. But by watching how sunlight moves across a wall, how a flower closes its petals, how the morning chill fades, the woman steps outside again. The shadow of her gnomon is now pointing in the opposite direction. It is long again, stretching toward the east as the sun lowers in the west. She doesn't need to ask what time it is. She can feel it in her body, in the way the warmth has softened, in the calls of birds returning to nest. They would touch the ground, feel its breath, and know the sun has passed its peak. It is time to rest. There, the sundial, called a gooey bow, was set in gardens and city squares. Chinese scholars studied the way shadows changed, not just over the day, but across the seasons. When sunlight passed through narrow stone slits on a particular day, it would illuminate a spiral carved into the wall, a mark of the turning year. In temples, oil lamps were filled to a certain level, and when the flame guttered out, a portion of the ritual had passed. In Japan, artisans crafted incense clocks, lines of fragrant powder shaped into spirals. The breath of the wind, the cry of a bird, the position of a shadow, the shape of the moon. These were not just poetic metaphors. They were the real instruments of ancient timekeeping, developed not in laboratories, but in the quiet noticing of the world. There were no alarms, but there were signals. There was no ticking, but there was rhythm. As the incense burned, a scent filled the air, and its position in the spiral marked the hour. These were clocks that not only told time, but made it beautiful, smelled it, felt it, watched it unfold. To those ancient peoples, time was sacred, and light was the language of the gods. These structures weren't just ceremonial. They were their way of sensing with the cosmos. The changing angles of light told them when to plant rice, when to burn incense, when to welcome the new year. Time wasn't ticking. It was unfolding like a lotus. She stirs before dawn, not because something buzzes beside her, but because the air has shifted. The breeze is cooler. A certain silence has fallen, the kind that comes just before the first birds begin their morning chorus. Around it are small stones arranged in a half circle. This is no modern instrument. It is a gnomon, a primitive sundial, but more than that, it is a quiet companion, telling her, through shadow and shape, how the day is breathing. As the sun rises, the post casts a long shadow, sweeping slowly across the arc of stones. She does not count hours. She watches the shadow move and knows it is time to wake the children, to tend the fire, to start the day's rhythm. She knows it's nearly time to begin grinding grain, not because she's late, but because the world around her is ready. The first humans did not wear watches. Picture a young woman in a grassland village, perhaps 10,000 years ago. Outside her hut, A slender wooden post stands upright in the ground. The use of shadows to track time, this early form of sundial, was among humanity's first steps toward measuring the world. But you didn't have to be a priest to read time in ancient Egypt. Far away in ancient China, something similar took shape. In Chaco Canyon, long before Europeans set foot in the Americas, the ancestral Pueblones built massive stone structures aligned with solstices. Even in the seemingly harsh, time-silent environments of the desert, humans found ways to feel time pass. Our ancestors didn't just look down to read time, they looked up. And then there was the moon. Its phases, waxing, full, waning, new, gave rhythm to life, especially in coastal and agricultural communities. Back in our village, the sun has passed its peak. That fire, it too becomes a clock. In ancient homes, the burning of a log could tell how long a story had lasted. Across the globe, time was not counted. It was observed. It is hard for us, living in a world obsessed with speed, to imagine such a life. And perhaps this is why the ancient world calls to us still, not just in mystery, but in method. As night falls in the village, the stars begin to pierce the sky like quiet witnesses. She does not ask what time it is. She knows the day has exhaled, and so has she. As dawn approached in the ancient world, there was a brief, sacred pause, a hush that blanketed everything. This was the liminal space between darkness and light, between sleep and wakefulness, and our ancestors honored it in quiet ways. A mother might stir in the shadows of her dwelling and listen to the wind rustling the trees before rising. In the far north, where the sun barely rose for months or lingered endlessly in the sky, people became even more attuned to the world's quiet cues. A change in the color of the clouds, a shift in the wind's direction, the behavior of birds or caribou. These became temporal signposts. They taught patience and reverence, a deep understanding that time was not an enemy to outpace, but a rhythm to live within. A shepherd might feel the coldness of the earth on his palms and know the sun was not far behind. Without clocks or alarms, they awoke not by command, but by the whisper of the world. While today each of us carries a private clock on our wrist or screen, in the ancient world, time was often collective. Villagers watched the same mountain's shadow fall across the same river, waited together for the moonrise, gathered at the same fire to mark the fading light. Time belonged to everyone and to no one, shared, observed, respected. In places where the seasons were extreme, even subtle hints carried meaning. A grandmother might begin a tale just as dusk fell, and by the end of the story, perhaps about a brave fox or a wandering spirit, night would have fully arrived. Storytelling became a kind of clock, too. The pacing of words matched the dimming of the sky. Children, drowsy from the tale, would drift into sleep without any need for a schedule. The world itself lulled them. Across cultures, morning rituals emerged naturally, guided not by ticking hands, but by light and air and sound. Fires were rekindled, not because a number dictated it, but because the chill told the body it was time. Think of the sun's golden fingers stretching across a field. Think of a fire burning quietly in the corner of a stone hut. Think of the wind changing direction at dusk, and a child listening for her grandmother's story to begin. Think of time not as something to measure, but something to feel. A companion, a dance, a breath, temples aligned with solstices, bonfires lit at equinox, offerings made at lunar thresholds. Even the architecture echoed time's rhythm. Stone corridors that glowed with sunlight only on the longest day, carvings that caught shadows only at harvest. These weren't coincidences. They were deliberate, awe-filled calibrations of space with sky. Grains were ground, animals released from their pens, water drawn from wells, all in tune with nature's silent pulse. This synchronization with the earth gave their lives a grounded, deliberate feel. To track time was to pay reverence to the cosmos, to understand when to plant, when to rest, when to marry or mourn. These weren't arbitrary decisions, but sacred acts of alignment. The night sky wasn't just beautiful, it was instructive. The fire wasn't only warmth, it was a guide. A mother's breath beside her child at dawn wasn't just comfort, it was the ancient rhythm itself. Theirs was not a fragmented day sliced by the tyranny of the hour, but a continuous unfolding from sunrise to starlight. You've felt it in the stillness before sunrise, in the hush of snowfall, in the instinct to pause when light filters just right through the trees. Our bodies remember what our calendars forget. We are not machines needing precise programming. We are beings of breath and blood and bone, made to move with the pulse of the natural world. It's easy to romanticize the past, but this way of being had its hardships too. A cloudy sky might obscure the sun for days. A sudden storm might erase shadow or wind cues. In those moments, people turned inward. They relied on memory, on oral tradition, on generational knowledge passed from parent to child. Grandparents taught their kin how to feel the morning in their bones, how to trust the hush of the earth, how to mark the passing of time by how birds quieted or the way their own muscles ached. In this sense, timekeeping was never just external. It was a form of deep listening, and it was deeply communal. Sometimes stories were told to mark time. In sacred spaces, this understanding deepened. Priests and priestesses watched the heavens not just for ceremony, but for the turning of time itself. In this way, Time wasn't separate from the divine, it was a portal into it. And this rhythm lives in us still, buried under digital noise, but never lost. So tonight, as you close your eyes and let this story settle into your breath, think not of alarms or schedules, and in that remembering, may you find rest. The fire has burned low now, its glow no longer casting strong shadows, but instead offering a warm, flickering breath against the cold of early dawn. In our imagined ancient village, sleep still lingers in most of the dwellings, but a few figures are already stirring. There's a quiet sense of awareness in the air, not of noise or alarm, but of rhythm. The day has not yet begun in full, but it is near. A quiet rustling of animal hooves, the distant hoot of an owl returning to roost, and the crispness of the air all serve as silent cues that time is gently turning forward again. Without clocks, these first stirrings of the day held great importance. They weren't just routines, they were rituals. Many ancient communities greeted the morning not by counting the minutes, but by observing the transformation of the world around them. Obelisks, those towering stone spires, often found near temples, served as solar markers. As the sun moved across the sky, the shadow of the obelisk would shift, stretching and shrinking in a silent ballet. People would measure their activities, prayers, offerings, moments of stillness, by how the shadow touched certain stones embedded in the ground. There was no need for bells or schedules. The sunlight was enough. In the Andes, shepherds knew the progression of the day by the behavior of their alpacas. The animals grazed in predictable patterns, shifting locations as the light and temperature changed. Nomadic herders across Asia watched their livestock with the same attentiveness. When goats became restless, or when camels began to ruminate, it signaled a natural change in the day's rhythm. In mountainous regions, the first kiss of sunlight against a peak became the natural start of the day. Imagine a large bronze vessel with a small hole at its base. As water slowly dripped out, the surface level would fall, passing etched markings along the inner wall. The slow, steady dripping mirrored the Taoist understanding of time and existence. Just as water finds its way through stone over centuries, time flows around and through us, not with force, but with patience. In quiet gardens or near temple courtyards, one might hear the faint trickle of water, as it marked time more reliably than the human voice. The passage of time, marked by water, felt like part of the natural world, not an intrusion, but a continuation. This is perhaps why their rituals were so deeply tied to the rhythm of the day. Morning brought purifications, afternoon brought labor, evening brought stories and silence. Even grief and celebration followed celestial cues. A stick or trail of incense powder would be carefully laid out in specific patterns, and its slow, curling smoke became both a signal and a sensory experience. Monks and poets alike used these incense clocks not to hurry themselves, but to align their thoughts and actions with the pace of the world around them. When the scent changed, when the smoke thinned, one knew, gently, that a moment had passed. Funerals often took place at dawn or dusk, the times of transition. We speak of hours and minutes as if they are bricks to be stacked, managed, and spent. But our ancestors moved through time the way one walks through a forest path, observing, listening, feeling. There was no urgency to reach the end. Markets opened with the morning light and closed as shadows stretched across stone streets. Time was public, not privatized by wristwatches or calendar apps. It was shared and slow. Children chased chickens in the sunlit dust. Elders sit outside their homes, weaving and humming. A man stands near a tall post, not checking his watch, but noticing how the shadow has shortened since sunrise. And as they move through their tasks, gathering water, mending tools, grinding grain, time is not the background hum of machinery. It is a living presence, a rhythm, a guide. They live with it, gently, humbly, and with grace. A woman tests the warmth of the soil between her fingers and decides it is time to plant. No one announces the hour, but everyone knows what needs to be done. They are not rushed, they are attuned. The walk itself was the point. Weddings aligned with full moons or solstices. Every act was a note in the great ongoing symphony of time. Water wasn't just a tool to track time. It was a metaphor for it, fluid, patient, and eternal. Each marking denoted a segment of time. People watched the water, not obsessively, but with calm assurance, knowing that time was passing gently, predictably. The soil, the crops, and the weather dictated what each part of the day would bring. In dense forests, where the sky was mostly hidden, the way sunlight filtered through the canopy at different times of day provided a natural sense of rhythm. Hunters and gatherers who moved through these forests knew the time by how the beams of light moved across familiar clearings. The soundscape changed too. Morning birds gave way to the buzzing of insects, which in turn faded into the calls of evening animals. Time passed like a song, each section with its own melody, its own signature. An experienced farmer could walk out onto a field and know by the smell of the earth and the angle of the light how far the morning had passed. The warm scent of dew evaporating from leaves, the way bees moved from flower to flower. Our ancestors didn't just see time, they smelled it, heard it, felt it. In Ethiopia, coffee ceremonies still retain echoes of ancient timekeeping. The grinding, roasting, and pouring of coffee takes a predictable length, and these moments, performed with intention, serve as their own kind of clock. People do not watch a timer. They wait for the smell of roasted beans, the sound of bubbling water, the warmth of steam against the face. Time is experienced, not measured. Even the angle of shadows beneath wheat stalks. It was an unspoken agreement between the land and its people. When the mountaintop blushed gold, the world was ready for work. The flooding of the Nile dictated everything: planting, harvesting, celebration. But even on a daily basis, people read the rhythms of the river like a calendar. They marked the mornings by how quickly the river fog lifted, or how far the sun's reflection stretched across the current. Their concept of time was not linear and segmented, but circular and layered, always returning, always familiar. Farmers relied on these subtle transitions more than anyone. Before time was broken into hours, their lives were marked by the needs of the earth. In the Nile Valley, where Egypt's ancient civilization thrived, the relationship between time and the river was intimate. This cyclical understanding of time also appeared in their architecture. In other parts of the world, trees themselves became timekeepers. There were even those who looked not to the land or sky, but to animals themselves as natural clocks. And still, there were others who read time in fire and water. In ancient China, during the Han Dynasty and beyond, water clocks became surprisingly sophisticated tools, but their origins were rooted in simplicity. These water clocks weren't just practical, they were symbolic. In Greece and Rome, similar principles were applied to more complex designs. Some water clocks included gears or bells that chimed softly at intervals. Time was not something to be feared or controlled in these ancient societies. It was to be honored, lived with, accepted. In Japan, the art of incense clocks emerged during the Heian period, where the passage of time was measured by the burning of fragrant incense. This idea of time as a multisensory experience is striking. So much of modern life has removed this texture from our days. Even in bustling cities of the ancient world, Thebes, Mohenjo-daro, Athens, people were rarely severed from nature's rhythm. Public spaces aligned with cardinal directions. And so we return again to our imagined village, now fully awake. The day stretches before them, not divided into sharp segments, but flowing like a river. They do not fear its passing, nor try to trap it in precise boxes. As the sun climbs higher and the air begins to warm, the day continues its quiet progression in the ancient world. In every corner of early civilization, from grassy plains to forest clearings, riverbanks to stone-paved cities, time continues to pass, not as a command, but as a companion. Where we today might glance at our phones or wall clocks, our ancestors tuned into subtler signals, a shift in light, a change in birdsong, the warmth of stone beneath their palms. Their awareness of time was sensory, intimate, and continuous. a shared agreement with nature, not an imposition upon it. In these societies, the middle of the day was often marked not by bells or breaks, but by the sun's oppressive gaze. The light at noon was something all people recognized instinctively. It struck the ground directly, cast almost no shadow, and often brought a stilled silence to human activity. Workers would pause, retreating into shade. Animals, too, would lie low. Noon was not just a time of light, but of stillness, a natural intermission in the day's labor. It was also a moment for reflection. In temples across Mesopotamia, priests knew that the shortest shadows of the day signaled not just physical noon, but spiritual alignment. In some traditions, this was when the gods were said to be most attentive, as their light fell perfectly from above. Offerings and prayers made at this time were believed to be particularly potent. To those early peoples, noon wasn't just a midpoint. It was a kind of communion between earth and sky. Beyond the spiritual, practical knowledge of this zenith-guided architecture, ancient buildings were often constructed with an awareness of how sunlight moved across them throughout the year. The Greeks, for example, positioned their homes and public spaces to maximize warmth in the winter and shade in the summer. In Mesoamerica, the builders of Teotihuacan aligned their entire city plan with the movements of the sun, creating avenues and pyramids that responded visibly to solstices and equinoxes. At noon on certain days, light would penetrate chambers or strike altars with precise brilliance, a fusion of design, astronomy, and reverence. By the time the afternoon began to stretch, shadows slowly lengthening across fields and stone walls, people resumed their work with renewed awareness. This part of the day was often associated with rhythm, harvesting, building, cooking. Movements became more deliberate. Children who had played freely earlier now fell into patterns, helping with chores or collecting firewood. The tempo of the day, once bright and chaotic, now became deeper, steadier. The golden light of late afternoon carried with it a sense of productivity, but also peace. One can imagine a potter in an Anatolian village, sitting cross-legged beneath a canvas awning, watching how the sunlight gradually slid across his workspace. He doesn't rush. He knows how much time is left in the day by the warmth on his skin, the position of the sunbeam on his tools, the tone of cicadas in the air. He has learned, through years of doing, how long clay takes to dry in this light, when to fire the kiln, when to rest. His sense of time is not bound to a schedule, but bound to craft and climate, to memory. In many parts of the world, the afternoon was also a time for oral tradition. Work continued, yes, but so did storytelling. Grandparents, too old for field work, would sit with the young and recount the cycles of the stars, the history of the village, the changing face of the moon. These stories were not frivolous. They encoded the very structure of time as their people understood it. One tale might explain the passing of seasons. Another, why a constellation appears in winter. Myth and memory wove together to form calendars of the heart. Even those who traveled, traders, herders, nomads, relied on deep temporal knowledge. Crossing deserts or dense forests, they couldn't rely on fixed clocks or mechanical markers. Instead, they knew to walk when the stars of Orion were behind them and rest when they hung above. They observed how dew gathered on grasses, how animal tracks appeared or vanished depending on the sun's angle. The world was their watch and their teacher. In India, the Vedic seers developed intricate systems of time based on celestial movement. Their observations were so refined that they divided the day into muhurtas, periods of roughly 48 minutes, each carrying unique spiritual significance. Certain muhurtas were considered auspicious for marriage, others for meditation, others for ritual. Though no mechanical clocks existed, the understanding of temporal nuance was profound. The seers knew that not all parts of the day were equal. Some were brimming with energy, others with quiet reflection. This division of the day into meaningful segments also appeared in Islamic traditions. Long before the invention of modern timepieces, the 5 daily prayers were observed by watching the sun. The position of the sun's shadow, whether short, angled, or vanished, determined the precise moment for prayer. Mosques were designed with mihrabs and courtyards that made sunlight easily observable. Muezzins learned how to read the sky, becoming human clocks, calling the faithful not by numbers, but by light. And as the day aged into evening, other cues emerged, subtle and yet universally recognized. The cooling of the air, the orange tint of the light, the return of certain bird calls. Fires were kindled not at 6 p.m., but when the last light bent low on the hills. Food was prepared not by timers, but by the instincts of the cook, who had watched the smoke from her pot rise in the same way for decades. The sense of evening was felt in the bones, not on the dial. In the Andes, farmers used long staffs to measure the angle of shadows cast by mountain peaks at day's end. When the light touched a certain stone outcrop, it was time to bring the llamas down from the heights. These weren't superstitions. They were inherited systems of observation, refined through necessity and held sacred through use. And what of time's passing, not in a single day, but across longer arcs? Ancient people were acutely aware of the passage of seasons, the turning of years. Their structures, from Stonehenge in Britain to the pyramids of Egypt, from Newgrange in Ireland to the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, were built to align not just with the sun, but with time itself. The fact that we can still stand in these places today, watch the sun hit the same mark it did 5,000 years ago, is a testament to their understanding and their patience. The year, too, was broken not into 12 equal months marked by paper calendars, but into events that mattered: the return of birds, the ripening of fruits, the first frost. These signs weren't just quaint, they were survival. They were the difference between abundance and hunger, between life and hardship. Festivals, often misunderstood today as mere entertainment, were temporal landmarks. They reminded people where they stood in the great wheel of the year. Whether it was the lighting of lamps for Diwali, the burning of effigies at Samhain, or the harvest dances of West Africa, each ritual was a way to say, we are here again. The cycle turns, and we are part of it. And always, always there was the sky. Even as dusk deepened and the sun slipped below the horizon, the ancients looked upward and found their bearings. The first stars to appear were always the same: Venus, the evening star, then the steady glow of the Milky Way. These celestial cues told them not only the hour, but the mood of the night, whether it would be still or stormy, whether the time had come for song, for sleep, or for silence. In the final hours of the day, as shadows disappeared and the wind changed direction, people once again let go of control and trusted the rhythm. The fire was stoked one last time, blankets arranged, stories ended, and without any ticking hands or mechanical chimes, time gently laid its head to rest. Night in the ancient world was not quiet in the way we often imagine. It was a living, breathing time, full of subtle sounds and ancient rituals, a period rich with awareness rather than emptiness. The absence of sunlight didn't bring a halt to activity, brought a different rhythm, one marked not by urgency, but by attentiveness. In this darkness, the world whispered instead of shouted, and time unfolded with the grace of starlight. With the sun below the horizon, shadows disappeared, and yet time did not. It simply changed its voice. Where people once watched the movement of light on walls, or measured the length of a shadow beneath their feet, they now turned to the night sky. Stars became their guide. In every corner of the world, from tundras to tropics, early people looked upward and found constellations that told them where they stood, not only in the season, but in the hour. These were maps, not just of space, but of time. The rising and setting of specific stars signaled distinct parts of the night. The ancient Egyptians knew that when Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, rose just before dawn, the annual flooding of the Nile was near. This event was so dependable, so pivotal, that it served as the cornerstone of their calendar. But Sirius was also a marker of its position during the night, told observers how far the darkness had progressed. In Polynesia, master navigators sailed vast oceans using similar star paths, knowing that if one star dipped below the horizon and another rose, they were halfway through the night's journey. Among the nomadic tribes of Central Asia, the movement of the moon was a more immediate tool. A shepherd waking in the middle of the night might judge the hour by the moon's position in the sky, or how much light spilled across the landscape. A full moon at its peak meant the night was half done. A low sliver on the horizon signaled the approach of dawn. The moon, like the sun, had a path predictable, knowable, sacred, and yet not all measures of nighttime were astronomical. Many were auditory. In rural communities, where the human ear was still attuned to nature's language, people learned to tell the time by the changing sounds of the world. The chirping of crickets, the calling patterns of night birds, the distant howls of wolves or jackals each had their own rhythm. These sounds were not random. They rose and fell with the passing hours, forming a kind of nocturnal symphony, one that informed the attentive listener of time's quiet progress. In Japan, monks in remote temples were known to tell time by the dripping of water into stone basins. These water clocks, or clepsydras, were especially valued during the night, when shadows were useless and stars might be hidden by cloud. A slow, steady drip echoed in the stillness, each drop marking a passing moment. The sound was meditative, hypnotic, and deeply tied to spiritual practice. Timekeeping, in this way, became inseparable from mindfulness. In other parts of the world, the burning of fuel served as a guide. Oil lamps and candles, used not just for light, but for marking the passage of time, burned at known rates. A candle carefully crafted to burn for 4 hours might be scored with lines along its shaft. As the wax melted and the flame descended, each line vanished, quietly indicating another portion of the night gone. In monasteries or watchtowers, monks and sentries alike would observe these markers. No clock was needed, only fire and patience. Even in ancient China, the ingenuity of the nighttime timekeeper reached artistic heights. Their incense clocks became popular not just for their fragrance, but for their reliable burn rate. Spiral trails of powdered incense were arranged on trays, each curve timed to a precise interval. As the ember moved slowly along the trail, it would ignite threads or drop small weights, gently chiming bells or triggering soft gongs. Time passed not with mechanical precision, but with ritual grace. These were clocks that soothed rather than stressed. Still, the most common way of telling time at night was perhaps the simplest, by human memory and feeling. In the same way, people could feel the warmth of the sun and know it was midday. They could also sense when the chill deepened and the quiet thickened that it was midnight. In some communities, the body itself became the clock. A woman rising to stoke the hearth might recognize by her own restlessness that she had slept through the first portion of the night. A man hearing the last hoot of an owl might know it was close to the final hours before dawn. In medieval Europe, towns were often governed by the rhythms of religious orders. Monasteries became centers of timekeeping, with monks rising at designated hours throughout the night to pray. Without the luxury of modern clocks, they relied on a mix of cues, the stars, water clocks, and internal instinct honed through years of repetition. These hours, matins, lauds, vigils, weren't merely moments on a dial. They were spiritual markers, dividing the night into sacred segments. For city dwellers in more populated regions, communal cues kept people oriented. In Islamic cities, the night was divided by the calls of the muezzin, who announced prayer times using the stars and sun as his guide. In Christian Europe, church bells tolled at fixed points, often rung by watchmen who scanned the streets and sky for their signal. These sounds became embedded in the urban atmosphericos that marked time as surely as any ticking device. Night was not an absence of timekeeping, it was simply a different form of it, a slower, more sensorial method. Where day relied on light and labor, night relied on sound, scent, intuition. It was a quieter kind of awareness, one that demanded attention not to numbers but to nature. And in many ways, it was deeply restorative. Without artificial light or digital devices, the human body naturally fell into rhythm with darkness. Sleep came more easily, dreams more vivid, and time, though still passing, seemed more like a tide than a treadmill. It is perhaps no coincidence that many ancient myths imagine night as a place of passage, not just literal movement through time, but journeys of the spirit. The hours of darkness were associated with transformation of ideas, emotions, even identity. The Greeks imagined Nyx, the primordial goddess of night, as both terrifying and nurturing. The Egyptians believed that Ra, the sun god, journeyed through the underworld each night before being reborn at dawn. In this way, the night was not just a passive backdrop, was an active force in the cycle of time. Even sleep itself was viewed differently. In many traditional cultures, sleep was not a single block of unconsciousness, but occurred in phases. What we now call segmented sleep was once the norm. People would drift off after dusk, wake in the middle hours to stoke a fire or reflect quietly, and return to rest until dawn. That wakeful period between sleeps was often used for prayer, storytelling, quiet love, or simply watching the stars. Time, in these hours, was not wasted, was contemplative. Back in our imagined village, this cycle unfolds again. A father wakes in the middle of the night, not to an alarm, but to the soft cry of his child. He stirs the embers of the fire, adds another log, and sits beside the flames, listening. Outside, the stars wheel overhead. He watches them, not with calculation, but with quiet trust. He knows this moment. He's felt it 100 times before. The hush, the cold, the slow return of light on the horizon. Soon others will stir. The birds will begin to call. The light will shift again. But for now, in this suspended hour, he simply sits. There is no rush, no number to reach, just time unfolding. The cycle of the sun and moon gave ancient people a way to understand days and nights. But as communities grew and their lives became more entwined with the rhythms of agriculture, survival demanded a broader vision. It was no longer enough to know when morning began or when night fell. They needed to know when to plant and when to reap, when to prepare for rain and when to expect snow, when to celebrate and when to mourn. And so they turned their eyes to longer arcs of time, the slow breathing of the earth itself. Seasons were among the earliest units of time to be recognized across every culture. Unlike ours, which required precise tools to measure, the seasons could be felt. The tilt of the sun, the angle of its rays, the arc it traced through the sky, all changed in a predictable, comforting way. To early agrarian societies, this rhythm wasn't merely interesting, it was everything. Crops depended on it. Livestock movements mirrored it. Human migrations and festivals followed it closely. In places like the Indus Valley, people aligned their planting with the arrival of monsoon winds. In Mesopotamia, flood cycles from the Tigris and Euphrates were used to track the passing of years. Every detail became a piece in the great puzzle of time. Because of this, early civilizations sought to fix the seasons in something more permanent than memory. They began to build, not with the goal of shelter, but with the goal of knowing. Monuments were erected to hold the sun still for a moment, to mark its position on a specific day, to carve time into stone. These weren't simply religious temples or royal tombs. They were calendars, massive open-air observatories that taught their builders how to return to a single moment again and again. Consider Stonehenge rising from the English plain in quiet defiance of modern understanding. For centuries, people have puzzled over its purpose, but among its many alignments, the most striking is solar. On the summer solstice, the sun rises in perfect line with its central axis. Those who placed those stones understood the sky, perhaps better than we do now. They knew that the longest day marked a turning point, a peak before decline, and that recognizing it gave them power over their world. Across the ocean, in what is now Guatemala, the ancient Maya built entire cities as star maps. At sites like Tikal, and pyramids and temples align with key celestial events, equinoxes, solstices, the rising of Venus. Their calendar systems, carved into stelae and codices, were so complex that they tracked not only solar years, but lunar cycles, planetary movements, and even the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. For them, time was layered and infinite. Every moment echoed another from the distant past or the distant future. Not all markers were grand. In villages scattered across the Scottish Highlands, simple stone circles were used to track the changing seasons. A child might notice that the sun began setting behind a different hill as winter approached. A shepherd might time his departure to summer pastures by when the morning mist thinned in a particular valley. These weren't official calendars, but they were trusted all the same. Quiet agreements with the land that had never failed them. In Egypt, the flooding of the Nile was both a blessing and a calendar. The ancient Egyptians marked the beginning of their new year with the heliacal rising of Sirius, a brilliant star that appeared just before dawn in midsummer. Its return foretold the inundation, the rising waters that refreshed their fields and brought fertility to the soil. This cosmic event was celebrated with joy, for it meant life could begin again. To them, the stars weren't just ornaments of the night. They were messengers of time itself. The Chinese lunisolar calendar divided the year into 24 solar terms, each representing a specific natural phenomenon: the awakening of insects, the start of summer heat, the first frost. These terms weren't arbitrary. They reflected careful, centuries-long observation of how the earth moved through its yearly breath. Even today, echoes of this calendar linger in traditional Chinese culture. But the passing of seasons wasn't only agricultural, it shaped how people saw life itself. In many cultures, the year was imagined as a circle, not a line. Spring was birth, summer, growth, autumn, harvest and maturity, winter, death and rest. Then came spring again. Human life was reflected in this eternal wheel. Children were spring, elders winter. This cyclical model gave comfort. Even as things faded, they would return. This worldview manifested in rituals. Harvest festivals weren't just celebrations of food, they were acknowledgments of time's bounty. Solstice fires weren't just symbolic lights in the dark. They were prayers for the sun's return. They were turning points, axis days, where the future began again. And while the heavens offered consistency, people still needed to remember. Memory, oral tradition, and intergenerational teaching became essential tools of timekeeping. In Aboriginal Australian culture, the Dreamtime stories told of ancestral spirits creating the land, sky, and patterns of life. They encoded when to hunt certain animals, when to burn grasslands, when to walk particular trade routes. The stars above were tied directly to the steps one took on Earth. In Native American traditions, winter counts, pictorial records, painted or carved onto hides, were used to remember each year's most significant event. Another, the summer of the Great Buffalo Hunt. These weren't timekeeping methods in the mechanical sense, but they tracked time in a deeply human way, through memory, experience, and shared story. And still, we see time embedded in the physical world. Trees, for example, hold the memory of time in their rings. Long before modern science confirmed it, some cultures believed old trees held wisdom that they had seen many years and thus carried knowledge in their silence. In places like Scandinavia, old trees were considered sacred and treated with reverence. People knew, even without counting, that they marked the passing of generations. Mountains, too, were timekeepers. A glacier's slow retreat or advance, the growth of lichen on rock, the shape of valleys formed by wind and water. These were long-form calendars, recording not days or years, but centuries. Some early cultures treated these features as alive, not metaphorically, but literally. The land aged as we do. The earth had its own timeline. In all of this, there's a striking truth. Without machines, without digital tools, without the need for relentless precision, ancient people still knew when they knew what time it was, not in seconds, but in meaning. And perhaps that's what we've lost. Today, we schedule our lives to the minute, fearing lateness, chasing productivity. But we often forget to feel the season, to watch the light, to sense the deep breath of the year. Time is now something we conquer, but it wasn't always so. Our ancestors moved with it, not against it. And even now, if you sit quietly and listen to the wind, to the birds, to the way the light changes on your walls, you can still hear the old rhythm. You can still feel the world turning. You can still tell time. As humanity's understanding of time grew richer and more layered, it became more than a tool for survival. It became a force of culture, something that shaped belief systems, social hierarchies, rituals, and even architecture. Time was no longer just a matter of sunrise and sunset, or planting and harvesting. It became sacred, it became symbolic, and through the centuries, it took on a presence so embedded in daily life that people no longer needed to name it, only to live with it. In the temples of ancient Sumer, priests kept watch over time with an attentiveness that bordered on reverence. They observed the sky from ziggurats, tiered towers that reached upward like stairways to the divine, and recorded the patterns of celestial bodies onto clay tablets. To them, the movement of the stars and the dance of the planets were not cold mathematical events, but messages from the gods. Each planetary shift was an omen, each solstice an instruction. The divine calendar was not printed, but observed, and only the most learned could interpret its meaning. These early priest astronomers held power, not through force, but through knowledge of time. They knew when to plant and when to fast, when to fear and when to celebrate. Their predictions of eclipses and omens cemented their authority and bound the people to cycles greater than themselves. Time, in this way, became institutionalized. It was not just natural, it was ruled. The same was true in the great civilizations that followed. In the highlands of Peru, the Inca built the Intihuatana, the hitching post of the sun. These carved stone pillars stood on mountaintops, aligned with the solar solstices. It was believed that during the winter solstice, the sun was tied to the earth with invisible cords, preventing it from fleeing further and ensuring its return. The ritual act of tying the sun gave people a sense of participation in the great celestial order, as though human hands could influence cosmic cycles. Religious life across the ancient world followed these rhythms with an almost musical precision. In Judaism, the appearance of the new moon marked the beginning of each month. The shofar, a ram's horn, would be blown to announce the arrival of a new period, a small but powerful act of synchronizing human life with the heavens. The Sabbath, too, was not just a day of rest, but a return to cosmic alignment, a miniature reenactment of the creation story, with 6 days of labor and 1 day of reflection. In Islam, the daily prayers, each dictated by the position of the sun. The first light before sunrise, the sun's zenith, the afternoon's slant, the fading of light, and the darkness of night. Each becomes a spiritual reminder that time is a gift and that each passing moment can be sanctified through awareness. In cities from Cairo to Samarkand, the call to prayer echoed across rooftops, aligning entire communities in one breath, 5 times a day. Christian monasticism adopted a similar reverence for temporal order. The liturgy of the hours, practiced by monks and nuns, divided the day and night into 8 distinct prayer times. Each was marked not by external chimes, but by internal stillness. In abbeys nestled in the foggy hills of medieval Europe, bells tolled softly in the dark, calling sleepers from their beds to chant psalms in candlelight. The rhythm of the monastery became a living clock, not of productivity, but of devotion. In the Buddhist traditions of East Asia, temple bells and incense were used not only to mark meditation periods, but to cultivate mindfulness of time as passing. A monk would light a long stick of incense, and when it had burned halfway, he would know to change posture or shift focus. The act was not hurried, it was not watched impatiently. The point was not measurement, but harmony. One did not act against time, but within it. Across all these traditions, time was elevated to something more than sequence. It became sacred structure, the scaffolding on which society, worship, and identity were built. It gave life shape. It gave suffering context. It gave joy its season. This sense of sacred time was often reflected in the calendar systems themselves. The Mayan Sokin, a 260-day ritual calendar, interwove numbers and deities in a way that touched every birth, every harvest, every political decision. Days were not just labels, they were personalities. To be born on one day versus another was to inherit a different fate, a different guardian, a different energy. Time was alive, colored by meaning, resonant with character. In Hinduism, the Yuga cycles described time on a grand scale, not in years or decades, but in epochs, vast periods that moved from purity to decline and back again. According to this philosophy, we are currently in the Kali Yuga, Kane age of darkness and confusion, destined to one day give way to rebirth. This cosmic vision of time reminded people that no moment was final, that all things, even sorrow, moved in cycles. The Cherokee and other Native American peoples similarly viewed time as a circle rather than a line. Their dances, songs, and oral histories looped with seasonal rhythm, not chronological record. Time was something you returned to, not something you left behind. Every year, a child might hear the same story told by a grandmother, not because nothing had changed, but because everything had, and the story helped make sense of it all. Repetition was not dull, it was essential. In every society, time shaped not only religion, but community life. Markets opened at certain sun heights. Children were taught to recognize meal times by the length of shadows. Weddings were held during waxing moons, funerals beneath waning ones. People slept, fasted, feasted, and wept in tune with the pulse of the world around them. Life's milestones were not measured by birth certificates or calendar years, but by the seasons of the soul. And just as the body aged, so too did time itself have a body, one that could be adorned, honored, and remembered. Festivals served as this body's heartbeat. Carnival, Lent, Easter, Diwali, Eid, Passover. All of these were not random events, but carefully timed acts of memory. Through them, communities re-entered old stories and made them new again. They reenacted, relived, and reminded themselves who they were. Perhaps one of the most beautiful examples of this is the Zoroastrian Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which falls on the spring equinox. At this perfect balance of light and dark, people gather to clean their homes, light fires, jump over flames, and lay out symbolic items, each representing a wish for the coming year. Time in this celebration is not a threat, it is a promise. In this way, time, once only measured by stars and shadows, grew to become something deeply human. It was structured, yes, but it was also filled with meaning. It could be sacred or profane, heavy or light, personal or communal. It was written into myth and ritual, into the scent of incense and the tone of bells. And even now, centuries later, echoes of this sacred time remain. We still celebrate solstices and equinoxes, often without realizing why. We still gather in times of harvest, We still mark the years, not only by numbers, but by memory. Asterisk, that was the summer she was born. That was the winter we lost him. Our hearts still keep their own calendars. As the need for structure grew within cities, within religion, within trade and governance, so too did the desire to capture time with more than instinct and sunlight. While many still lived by the rhythms of the earth and sky, urban societies began to reach for something more tangible, devices that could carve time into usable, shareable portions, tools that could be read not just by a trained priest or seasoned farmer, but by anyone who stood before them. One of the earliest and simplest inventions was the sundial, a tool that used the sun's own movement to mark the hour. The principle was straightforward. A stick or stone, placed upright, would cast a shadow that moved predictably as the sun arced across the sky. Over time, people learned to place this gnomon on a flat surface and mark where the shadow fell at key intervals throughout the day. What began as a rough guess became a system. By watching the shadow's length and direction, a person could divide the day into manageable portions. Sundials emerged independently in many ancient cultures. In Egypt, as early as 1500 BCE, sloped stone sundials were used to divide the morning and afternoon into 4 parts, each 8 intervals total. These weren't just instruments for elites. In bustling marketplaces and public courtyards, they stood as communal references, allowing citizens to coordinate prayers, business, or rest. The sun, already revered as a deity, now served also as a scheduler. The Greeks improved on the concept, experimenting with concave and hemispherical sundials that offered more precise shadow tracking, especially as they began grappling with the fact that the length of daylight changed with the seasons. They added hour lines based on astronomical observations and adapted sundials for use in various latitudes. In this pursuit, they edged closer to abstraction. Time was no longer just observed, it was engineered. But the sundial, for all its elegance, had a flaw. It relied entirely on the sun. At night, on cloudy days, during storms or heavy fog, it was useless. And so, other civilizations sought methods that could keep pace even in darkness. Enter the water clock, or clepsydra, one of the oldest timekeeping tools in the world. The concept was beautifully simple. A container would slowly fill or empty with water at a controlled rate, and the change in level could be used to measure time's passage. In Mesopotamia and later in Greece, vessels were marked with lines to indicate hours. In China and India, more complex versions emerged, with gears, floats, and mechanisms that rang bells or moved figures as water flowed. These devices allowed time to be measured continuously, day or night, indoors or out. Courts used them to limit speeches. Astronomers used them to record observations. In temples, priests used them to measure ritual intervals. They were dependable, consistent, and remarkably advanced many models, achieving surprising accuracy. By the 3rd century BCE, Chinese engineers like Zhang Heng were designing water clocks that incorporated mechanical elements, wheels and scoops driven by water, effectively creating the first regulated motion systems. These designs were forerunners of the escapement mechanisms that would define future mechanical clocks 1,000 years later. Other cultures turned to fire. In India and Persia, candles became a way to mark hours. Wax or tallow candles were made to burn at predictable rates, and when marked with evenly spaced lines, they served as visible timers. In some cases, small metal balls were inserted at intervals within the candle so that as the wax melted, the balls would fall onto a metal plate with an audible ping-an, early form of alarm. In Japan and China, incense clocks took this concept even further. Intricate spirals of powdered incense were shaped to burn for hours, sometimes even an entire day. Their scent marked not only time's passage, but its mood. Certain temples used distinct incense blends for morning, afternoon, and evening, so that a trained nose could not only tell the time, but feel it emotionally and spiritually. In the Islamic Golden Age, the drive to understand and measure time took a great leap forward. The needs of religious observance required precise knowledge of sunrise, noon, and sunset, and so astronomers and mathematicians flourished. Al-Jazari, in 1206 CE, described a series of astounding mechanical clocks in his Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, including elaborate water clocks with automatic humanoid figures, rotating planets, and symbolic representations of zodiac signs. One of his most famous inventions, the elephant clock, incorporated elements from Greek, Indian, Arab, and Chinese traditions. It was not just a timepiece, but a celebration of cultural knowledge, of fusion of form, function, and philosophy. At every half hour, a hidden mechanism would trigger a performance. Birds chirped, dragons breathed steam, and a man with a pen recorded the hour. It told time not with digits, but with wonder. These elaborate timekeeping machines were as much expressions of artistry as of science. They weren't hidden behind glass or installed as private utilities. They stood in public spaces, temples, mosques, and palaces, serving as symbols of a city's intellect and spiritual order. Time was no longer something you simply watched, was something you celebrated. Even the mechanical clock, which would eventually dominate Europe, was born from a desire not for control, but for community rhythm. The earliest mechanical clocks were installed in towers, not homes. They rang bells at fixed intervals, organizing monastic life, civic duties, and urban activities. The chime marked prayer, meals, curfews. It was not personal time, but shared time. a reminder that all were part of the same temporal fabric. Still, in many parts of the world, these new technologies coexisted with the old. A sundial might sit beside a water clock. A monk might light a candle while watching the stars. A child might count heartbeats just as her ancestors did, while waiting for a pot to boil or a storm to pass. New inventions didn't replace old instincts. They simply offered another layer. And this layering is what made ancient timekeeping so rich. It was never about precision alone. It was about balance between nature and invention, between feeling and form. Even as people learned to build more accurate devices, they retained a sense of time as something you experienced, not just measured. To walk through a city like Baghdad in the 9th century or Chang'an in the Tang dynasty was to hear time in bells, to smell it in incense, to see it in shadow and water. In the public gardens, poets wrote verses about the passing of hours. In schools, scholars debated how long a moment should last. In the streets, merchants timed contracts by the length of a candle or the angle of a sundial's shade. Everywhere, time had become visible, audible, aromatic, poetic, and perhaps most importantly, it had become shared. This was one of the greatest shifts in human history. Time moved from the personal to the collective, where once it was something you felt by the sun on your back or the silence of midnight, it now became something a whole town could hear, could see, could agree upon. That shared sense of when was the foundation for everything that followed. Governance, commerce, transportation, education, celebration. You cannot build a world without a shared clock. The best clocks mimicked the sun. The most precise schedules still yielded to weather, to sickness, to surprise. Time remained fluid, bendable, alive. We were not yet slaves to it. We were still companions. And in that era of ingenuity and grace, we did not simply watch time pass. We listened to it sing. There remained an aspect of time that could not be carved in stone or burned in wax. It was how people lived it, how they taught it to their children, not as something to fear or master, but something to trust. In many ways, ancient timekeeping began in childhood, not with instruments or observation, but with rhythm. A lullaby sung in the same way each night became a marker. When this song ends, it is time for sleep. A mother's hand wiping a face at dawn, a father's voice humming while chopping wood, a grandmother's whispered prayer at dusk. All of these were as much clocks as any sundial. They taught a child when a day began, how it unfolded, and when it ended, without ever naming the hour. The first clocks we inherit, after all, are human. The beating of a heart, the slow breath of a parent cradling us, the cadence of footsteps through a field, through drums and bells, through songs that marked labor and rest. These rhythms shaped daily life, anchoring it not in deadlines, but in repetition and familiarity. In the Andean highlands, shepherd children learned to time their return home not with devices, but with song. Their elders taught them long melodies tied to walking pace. If they sang one tune, it would carry them to the halfway point of a grazing trip. A second tune would bring them home by dusk. This was not imprecise. It was intuitive, a kind of embodied knowledge passed from mouth to ear to footstep. In Japan, seasonal festivals were tied to blossoms and winds, not calendars. A girl knew it was time to prepare for the doll festival when plum blossoms opened. A fisherman in coastal Greece might know the season had changed when the stars shifted subtly at sea, or when a certain bird cried in the hills at night. These moments were not always written down. They were remembered, handed from one generation to the next, like a familiar cup or a worn tool. And yet, in every society, there were those who held time more formally, the keepers, the watchers, the rememberers, passing down dates and events, not with ink, but with voice. They could recite, without pause, the year a king was crowned, the season a great drought came, the generation in which a war began. Their knowledge was precise, not in seconds or hours, but in the woven tapestry of story and time. The winter when the seal disappeared, the long summer of the red fish. These weren't imprecise memories. They were deeply accurate, grounded in real environmental markers. But perhaps the most profound way time was shared and shaped was through ritual. The planting of a tree after a loved one's death, the gathering of herbs at a specific moon. These actions gave time meaning. They gave moments weight. These designs were swept away by the day's wind and foot traffic, only to be redrawn the next dawn. This was not merely decoration. In parts of Scandinavia, people carved calendar sticks, wooden staffs marked with notches for each day of the year, symbols for saints' days, agricultural tasks, and feasts were added, forming a tactile timeline that could be read by feel as much as by eye. These sticks were not owned by rulers or priests, but by households. They were practical and poetic, holding the rhythm of the year in the grain of wood. In Central Asia, nomadic tribes used the behavior of animals to measure the passage of time. The blooming of plants and the shedding of fur were signals. Even now, in parts of Mongolia, herders mark parts of the year by the condition of horses, coats, or the movement of herds across open land. Time, here, is inseparable from the body of the earth. But in these ancient lives, time was also deeply emotional. It was tied to longing, to memory, to fear and joy. A traveler might count time not in miles, but in nights spent away from home. A woman might measure her child's growth not in years, but in seasons. Asterisk, he was born just before the snow. and now the apples are ripe again. When death came, it, too, became a marker. The year a beloved father died, the summer after the famine. These emotional timestamps were engraved not in stone, but in hearts, and they carried weight long after numbers faded. In storytelling, time took on texture. Ancient myths weren't always told in strict chronological order. It might contain 1,000 years in a breath, or linger for pages on a single moment. This wasn't confusion. And so, even without clocks, people were rarely lost in time. In fact, they may have been more present than we are. They did not rush, they noticed. They knew when to rise, when to gather, when to sing, when to rest. Their days had texture, their nights had silence, and their lives moved in rhythm with forces both vast and intimate. Today, as we surround ourselves with alarms, timers, and reminders, we often believe we've conquered time. We wear it on our wrists. We plan it months in advance. But in doing so, we've also lost something: the gentle noticing, the felt rhythm, the quiet alignment with the world around us. In ancient lives, time was not imposed, it was lived. It arrived not in numbers, but in smells and songs, in shadows and wind. In the hand of a loved one, brushing your shoulder at the exact moment the stars shifted in the sky. It was not always measured, but it was always known. As we follow the trail of ancient timekeeping deeper, we come to a remarkable realization. Some of the oldest clocks in the world were not instruments we could carry or objects we could move, but places we had to stand within. These were vast, sacred architectures, temples, tombs, standing stones, and ceremonial mounds, built not only to honor gods or ancestors, but to mark the sun, the stars, and the seasons themselves. They were calendars in stone, timepieces carved into the landscape, meant to endure for centuries and align human life with cosmic rhythm. Imagine walking at dawn through the misty hills of ancient Britain. The wind is low, the grass heavy with dew. Ahead stands a circle of massive stones, cold, solemn, unmoving. But something is about to happen. As the sun breaks over the eastern horizon, its first golden beam slips perfectly between two towering stones and spills across the center of the circle, striking a single point on the altar rock. This is not accident. It is alignment. It is timekeeping. This was the essence of structures like Stonehenge, which, though shrouded in mystery, shows clear solar alignments, especially with the summer and winter solstices. To ancient observers, this moment of light-piercing stone was more than a spectacle. It was a message. It told them the wheel of the year had turned. The days would now grow longer or shorter. It was time to prepare for harvest, for winter, for celebration or stillness. And this wasn't unique to Britain. Across the globe, from the deserts of Egypt to the jungles of Central America, Ancient civilizations shaped stone and space to echo the sky's turning. In Nabda Playa, a prehistoric site in southern Egypt, stone circles aligned with the summer solstice long before the pyramids rose from the Nile's banks. These alignments helped early pastoral societies anticipate seasonal rains, essential for survival. But nowhere, perhaps, was the union of time and architecture more breathtaking than in Mesoamerica. The Maya, whose cities pulsed with ceremony and science, built pyramids that served as both sacred centers and astronomical instruments. At the temple of often called El Castillo becomes a living calendar during the spring and autumn equinoxes. As the sun sets, the western face of the pyramid casts a series of triangular shadows that resemble a serpent slithering down the staircase. At the base, the carved head awaits. This shadow serpent only appears twice a year, and to the Maya, it marked the precise balance of light and dark, a time to sow, to harvest, to honor the gods who gave time its rhythm. Even further south, the Inca, high in the Andes, constructed Intihuatana stones, hitching posts of the sun. These carefully angled pillars, often placed at the heart of ceremonial sites like Machu Picchu, were used to track solstices and equinoxes. At key points in the solar year, the sun would sit directly above the stone, casting no shadow. To the Inca, this meant the sun was tied to the earth, a cosmic pause in its journey, acknowledged with prayer and festival. In Asia, sacred timekeeping was often woven into temple design. In India, Hindu temples were traditionally constructed based on Vastu Shastra, an ancient system of architecture aligning structures with cardinal directions and celestial movements. Many temple sanctums were designed so that on particular feast days, a shaft of sunlight would fall upon the deity's face or sacred object, a moment of divine alignment between sky and stone. Likewise, in Cambodia, the vast temple complex of Angkor Wat, built by the Khmer Empire, wasn't merely a monument to kings. Its very layout is an astronomical calendar. Its central tower aligns with the spring equinox sunrise, and many of its corridors and reliefs record lunar cycles and solar transitions. To enter Angkor Wat was to walk through time, a journey both earthly and celestial. But sacred timekeeping wasn't always about the grand or the monumental. In many indigenous American cultures, humble earthworks were shaped into vast ceremonial calendars. The Great Serpent Mound in Ohio, winding more than 1,300 feet across a ridge, is thought to align with solstices and lunar standstills. Its curves and coils do not simply mimic a snake. They reflect the heavens, a map of time inscribed in soil and grass. And in Africa, near Lake Victoria, the Namoratonga site features 19 basalt pillars aligned with constellations as they would have appeared over 2,000 years ago. The Barana people of Ethiopia and Kenya are believed to have used these stones as a lunar calendar, tracking phases of the moon with astonishing accuracy. These places, these stone calendars, reveal something more than technological achievement. They reflect a mindset deeply different from our own. Modern timekeeping aims for portability, precision, and control. Ancient timekeeping, especially in sacred spaces, emphasized participation. You had to go to the place, you had to wait for the moment, you had to witness the light strike stone, the shadow shift, the serpent descend. Time was an event, not a number. It was a relationship, and it was often communal. Entire villages might gather at these sacred spots to watch the solstice sun rise. Children would be told the story of why this moment mattered. Elders would share songs that only made sense under this sky, at this place, on this day. Time was not private. It was shared, seen, and felt together. In some cultures, these architectures became not just clocks, but teachers. In ancient China, observatories and temples often featured gnomon towers, tall structures used to cast shadows for measuring solar movement. The famous Gaoshang Astronomical Observatory, dating back to the 13th century, included a 40-foot-long stone gnomon used to refine the Chinese calendar and study the solar year. This blending of science and spirituality shows how sacred and practical time were never far apart. But even as time was etched into stone and earth, it was always meant to be felt. These monuments didn't merely track time, they made people feel part of it. A young woman watching the serpent shadow slide down El Castillo might feel the pulse of her ancestors. A priest observing noontime sun atop an Egyptian obelisk might see not just hours, but harmony. These structures weren't about control. They were about reminding us of our place in something vast. Even in societies without writing, without wheels or metals, the sky remained readable. The stones made it legible. Time became tactile. And in this unity of earth and sky, body and cosmos, ancient people found peace. Today, we rarely build to the stars. Skyscrapers reach upward, but without alignment. Our homes aren't placed for solstices. Our plazas don't mark equinoxes. We tell time by rectangles glowing in our pockets. But the memory of sacred timekeeping still lives in ruins, in stone shadows, in the way light falls across a doorway in a silent, ancient place. Perhaps as we walk among these monuments, we're not just tourists. We're students again, witnesses, participants in a quieter way of living, one where time was not hurried or hidden, but revealed with reverence. So when the next solstice comes, or the full moon casts its pale glow on your window, consider looking up. Or better yet, go somewhere still, somewhere old, somewhere open to the sky. and let the world tell you what time it is, not by numbers, but by light, by shadow, by memory. As we come to the final stretch of our journey through ancient time, a quiet question rises to the surface, one that those early watchers of sun and moon may have also asked, long before the invention of the hourglass or the striking bell. What is time, really? Not the ticking, not the counting, not the math, but the experience, the feeling of it. To the ancients, time wasn't always a straight line. Often it was seen as a circle, a wheel turning endlessly, not toward progress, but toward return. The sunrise was not the start of something new, but the rebirth of something eternal. The seasons did not march forward into novelty, but spiraled back toward memory. The planting, the harvest, the celebrations, they all came again and again, not as repetition, but as rhythm. This idea that time is lived in cycles gave comfort. It meant that nothing was truly lost, that what fades will bloom again, that sorrow, though deep, will be followed by laughter. It taught people to trust not in clocks, but in seasons, to listen not for alarms, but for winds shifting, for birds returning, for a child's first word spoken under the same stars that once guided their ancestors. In Homeric Greece, time was not always marked by quantity, but by quality. The word kairos was used to describe the right, meaningful moment, time as opportunity, as readiness. It was the moment to act, to speak, to love, to let go. Ancient people recognized this form of time. It wasn't predictable, but it mattered. It arrived like a breeze on a still day, and you had to feel it, not measure it. In contrast, Chronos was the ticking kind, linear, numbered, indifferent. But to live entirely in Chronos was to forget the softness of time, the kind of time that unfolds while listening to a story, or watching a shadow creep along a wall, or holding someone's hand until sleep overtakes both of you. This was sacred time, felt time, time that passed through you rather than rushing past. And perhaps this is why so many ancient cultures regarded time as something divine, or at least not fully graspable. In Hindu cosmology, time is both creator and destroyer, the dance of Shiva, who spins the universe forward while folding it inward. In Norse myth, Yggdrasil, the great tree of life, holds within its branches the past, present, and future all at once, a living calendar pulsing with fate. The Egyptians measured time with astronomical precision, yet their tombs and temples tell us that they did not fear its passage, only its misuse. To them, death was not the end of time, but a transition to another rhythm. One's heart was weighed against a feather, a moment not of fear, but of balance. In the Taoist tradition, the ideal was not to conquer time, but to flow with it. The Tao, or way, moved like a river. sometimes fast, sometimes still. The wise did not try to control the current. They listened, watched, and moved when the moment was ready. This perspective of time as something to be in relationship with is perhaps the most forgotten in our modern world. Today, we fight time, we race it, we curse it, we try to stretch it, save it, kill it. But in ancient life, time was not the enemy. It was the medium in which everything meaningful occurred. It was presence itself. And presence came, more often than not, through attention. Think of the farmer kneeling in soil, waiting for the first green shoot, or the sailor watching the stars to find his way home, or the grandmother telling a story by firelight, knowing when to pause for breath and when to speak the final word. These people were not late or early. They were right on time because they were in time. Our ancestors may not have had watches, but they had awareness. And in that awareness lived a kind of peace, a kind of dignity. Life unfolded as it needed to. Days passed, not in panic, but in pace. Meals were shared when hunger stirred. Songs were sung when dusk deepened. No one checked the hour. They checked the sky. They listened to the wind. They watched each other. And in watching, they remembered. They remembered the smell of the earth after the rain in the 3rd month. They remembered the sound of geese returning in spring. They remembered that on this day, 10 years ago, someone was born, or someone died, or someone promised they'd return and did. Memory was how ancient people kept time, not with numbers, but with meaning. And isn't that still true? We do not recall our lives in minutes. We remember moments, fleeting, unmeasurable, sacred moments. The way sunlight fell through the window when you first held your child, the breathless silence of the world, the morning after snow, the look on a friend's face when they said goodbye without needing to speak. That is time. And for all our advances, for all our technology and tracking and time-stamping, we still return to that. We still lie in bed, not counting seconds, but recalling seasons. We still look at the stars, even if we've forgotten their names, and feel a flicker of what our ancestors must have felt: wonder, awe, a strange and beautiful sadness at how time slips by, and yet how it somehow carries us home. So tonight, as you rest, remember this: you are not late, you are not behind. You are exactly where countless generations once stood, in the quiet between sunset and stars, listening to the world breathe. You are in time, and time, when you let it, is soft.